It's 11:10, so it's about time I start. I have a lot to discuss today. Some of it will be easy, some of it will be a bit more difficult. I hope there will be something for everyone. But this is about common caching mistakes that I've noticed that you all make, without exception, and they make either your site slow or insecure. It's usually one or the other. So, my name is Kristiaanvandeneynde. You can find me on Drupal.org under my full name. You can email me at kristian@factorial.io, and on Slack, I'm kristiaanvde. I don't have any other socials anymore. I used to be on Twitter, then I deleted that, tried to be on Blue Sky, and then I realized I actually don't like social media, so I just deleted all of my accounts. So, I am the maintainer of the cache and user subsystem in core. I'm the author and maintainer of the group module, group sites, and many other modules in its ecosystem. And I'm a highly sensitive person. I always put this into my first slides because it means that all of the stimuli in the world hit me really hard, so noise in the room, light, whatever. It can cause hyperventilation, panic attacks. So I always put this in my slide because if I suddenly fall down, it could be that I passed out because of this. Sometimes that happens. Usually it doesn't, but sometimes that does. I always mention, it's not a heart attack. Probably, please do check. I would appreciate that. There is one special thing to mention on this slide that I didn't have in there when I started preparing this, is that sadly, after 7 beautiful years, Factorial and I are parting ways. So at the end of August, unless I find something else, I will be out of a job. I'm not gonna put any more detail into this because that's not what you're here for, but I'm just putting that out there because if you are looking for something, someone really talented who knows a lot about caching and everything, you might drop me a line on one of these ways to contact me. I really wish I hadn't deleted LinkedIn at this point. But anyways, let's continue. So, access results. Before we do anything with that, does everyone know what access result is, the class? Can I see some hands? You all used it, right? I'm gonna make you question why, because it's a trap. So access result has a lot of landmines, and they are aplenty, and the 3 major ones are as follows. So we have the methods cache per user and cache per permissions. Now, they are not the problem in itself, but the way people tend to use them is the problem. And it leads to incomplete cacheability in your return values. Now, incomplete cacheability is where you get security vulnerabilities, because you will be showing things to people that shouldn't be seeing them, right? Alternatively, it could lead that you're denying access to things that people should be seeing, but that's just annoying, it's not a security issue. So that is the first one. Now, the second one is the methods andif and orif, where you combine multiple access results together. So they tend to run code that doesn't need to run, and they add cacheable metadata that doesn't necessarily need to be added. Now, too much cacheable metadata is theoretically, I'm going to be careful here, never a security issue, but it's always a performance issue, because you will be invalidating your cache more often than you need to, and you will have more variations than you want to. So that leads to a slow performing website. And then finally, so we've already had too little cacheability, now we have too much cacheability, and then we have no cacheability. So there is this parameter that you can set in some of the access handlers, for instance, where you can choose whether you want to get the calculations that we just did as an object or just as a Boolean. And by default, we get it as a Boolean. So all of the calculations that we just did to figure out how we should cache the things that we just calculated, we just throw right out the window, which is obviously a really, really, really bad idea. Now, there's a history behind this, and we're talking about fixing this, but essentially it's something that we needed to do when we tried to get Drupal 8 launched, but we never really got back to that. So, you might be asking, everything I just showed, isn't that like the whole thing? And well, yeah, pretty much, yeah. So sorry about that. So we're actually asking you to use a class, and you still need to, but most of it is sort of like, yeah, a bunch of landmines, and you will probably step on them on multiple occasions. Not great, but anyways. Yeah, I put this slide in there because I was expecting this face in the room right now, like everyone realizing, oh shit, we've been using all of this, and apparently it's so broken, but yeah. If you're old like me, you know that face. If not, you should, because it's great. Anyways, cache per user and cache per permissions. I've taken a modified example from core, from the shortcut module. I say modified because we have since fixed this, but this is, well, for a long while, but this is an example of how people tend to use these methods. So as you can see, we have a permission check, and if that fails, we return an access result and we cache that per permissions, right? If that succeeds, we continue further down. Now here, the next return values no longer cache per permissions, but they really should, because you started off with a permission check, so everything after that point varies by permissions. Even though you're checking something completely different, like is there an account, or is the account the current user, it still varies by permissions. Right? So for instance, in this example, we're checking for a permission, and let's say that that permission check succeeds, and we don't get a passed in, we do get a passed in account, so we need to check whether you're the owner of that account, right? So we return allowed and we cache that per user. Now we have something that varies per user. You're always going to be that user. So from this point onwards, you're always going to get an access result allowed, even if your permissions change. So if you no longer have these switch shortcut sets permission, we're still going to return an allowed access result from the cache, which is really bad. So that's why in core, this is the actual code in core, you see something like this. So we check for a permission, and we vary by permissions, and everything after that also varies by permissions. Now, this is cumbersome, because this example that I've taken from core actually has many more return statements. And all of them need to repeat all of this information. So as you know, when we're only human, when you have to repeat a lot of stuff, you make mistakes. Even if you know that you have to do this, you still forget about it, so you make mistakes. So what I recommend doing is, and this is something that in every merge request that I put into core right now where we fix cacheable metadata, this is the recommended approach that I tell people to use. You start off with an empty cacheable metadata object at the very top, and whenever you check something, you immediately add the cache context or cache tags or whatever that is related to that check to your cacheable metadata. And from that point on, all you need to do in every single return statement is add that cacheable metadata object as the dependency. So as you can see, at first we vary by permissions, we add that. Then we vary by nothing extra, so we don't need to worry. And then we vary by user, we add that. And if there are more return statements after this, they all get all of that information, and you don't need to worry about repeating it. So that's my recommended approach. If you do this, you will be less likely to forget cacheable metadata. And as I said, too little cacheable metadata leads to security issues. So let's look at and if and or if. And if and or if, so let's take an example from core again, they tend to do too much. So if we analyze this code, we notice that if you have a permission, we're going to also check that the entity is active, and we're going to add that as a cacheable dependency. Now in this case, that code, that and if, always runs, right? So we're always adding that cacheable dependency of the entity. However, what happens if you don't have the permission? Because and if will only return allowed, I think I wrote that down, if the original access result is allowed and the extra access result is allowed. If either of them is neutral or forbidden, it cannot return allowed. So if you do not have that permission, you will get a neutral access result, at which point we can never make that allowed. It's not possible. So why are we running the code between the parentheses of and/if and adding cacheable dependencies if we're never going to have a result that actually is what we are looking for here? And this is just an example from core, but I've seen examples where the code inside the and/if is actually really expensive. So you're running expensive code for no reason. So there is an issue about this on Drupal.org, and don't worry about the links, there is a recording, so you should be able to get those links later on. So there's an issue about this on Drupal.org where we're trying to at least fix this so that and/if and or/if use callables, so that we don't run any code and we don't add any cacheable metadata unless the internal logic figures out, hey, with the initial result, we still have a chance to get, the expected results, and then we run that code. But it's still like work in progress. So how can you fix this? Well, the top part is how we basically do it. So now we check for the permissions. So this is what's in core right now. And if the access result is allowed, which we check ourselves, then we run that and/if. As I mentioned, if it's not allowed, we don't need to run it. There is ironically still a mistake in core here, because at the bottom, we have that or/if, and or/if suffers from the same problems, just slightly differently. So while we fixed the upper part, we forgot to fix the lower part. Now, return as object is false. Not much to say here, so I'll just show you one example from template preprocess username. We have a variable that we send to the template, which defines whether or not you have access to link to the profile, right? So we call account access view. But none of that cacheable metadata is passed along. And we so happen to have two bugs in core that canceled each other out, but when we fixed the one, we started seeing issues with this one. So ideally, what you would do here is you would get access with return as objects true, so that would be the extra parameter that you would add, and then you would merge that into the cacheable metadata that you can set in variables in a preprocess function. So that's what you should be doing, and that's what we should be doing in core. There is an issue about this. We're still in the process of fixing it. There's a theme here. We're still in the process of fixing a lot of things. But yeah, it's sometimes just me and a couple of other people working on these types of issues. So, second story, still on the easier side. Not using lazy builders, which means that you're getting to the render cache far too late. So, how the render cache works. In the render process, we have more or less 5 steps. You build an array, which we call a render array. You take that to the render cache. You don't manually do that, but by virtue of rendering it, we do that for you. So you take that to the cache, and you check whether we have a rendered version of that array in the cache. Then if we don't, we actually render it, which means that we take it to the templates, we get the HTML output, and we store all of that in the cache. And then we send that to the response, along with everything else that we want to send to the response. If it's cached, we build that array, we check the cache, we get a hit, and we send that to the response, right? Cool. Seems okay. However, we need to zoom in on step 1, the thing where we build the array. So I hope this is zoomed in enough. I think it is. So let's look at some example codes. Let's say I want to build a really expensive list to build, where I show just the labels of a bunch of entities, right? That's really expensive, because I have to load all of these entities, and loading entities is generally expensive. Now, I have my theme item lists, and in a loop, I'm going to load all of these entities, and I'm going to ask for their label. Funny story, last night I was checking my slides, and even though this talk is about caching, I forgot that last line. So when you show labels, you really need to have those entities as a cacheable dependency. I forgot that one. So that would have been really embarrassing. But I'm just mentioning it so that you know that we all still make mistakes. Now, what is the problem with this? We want to take this to the cache, right? But before we went to the cache, we loaded, let's say, 20 entities. Why? That's stupid, because if we have this in the cache, then we no longer need to load these entities. We already have rendered HTML with the labels of those entities somewhere in the cache. So why are we loading them again? So you need to make that cheaper up front, and you can. So by using a lazy builder, for instance. So now your render array looks like this, and there are multiple ways to specify a lazy builder. This is one of them, where you specify a service and then a method on that service. But as you can see, now we're just passing the entity IDs to a lazy builder. Nothing happens at this point. It's not being called. Instead, we have this really cheap array where we didn't load any entities, and we can also take that to the cache. So let's see how lazy builders affect our flow. So as you notice, step 1 and 2 are sort of exchanged right now. They're switched. Because first of all, we still build an array, but as I mentioned, it's really, really, really tiny. And we take that to the cache, right? So we've done no heavy lifting, and we can still ask the cache, do we have rendered output for this? If we don't, then we call the lazy builder, and the lazy builder will build that render array that we had in the first place, the one with the theme item list in my case. It will build that one, load all of those 20 entities, add those labels, add the cacheable dependencies, and all of that. It will get rendered, it will be set in the cache, and we will send that to the response, like we did before. So when it comes to that, there's no performance difference, so to speak. We still did all of the heavy lifting. But if we get a cache hit, now we've got this really cheap render array, we went to the cache, we got our hits, and there's nothing that we need to do. We never loaded those entities throughout the whole request. So this is why you really, really, really need to start using lazy builders. And it's a pet peeve of mine, because in my opinion, we should use that everywhere. As soon as you mention cache keys, you should immediately resort to a lazy builder, because it doesn't hurt, but it can help you. So that's my opinion, and I'm sure probably some people will fight me on this, but I think it will do you more good than harm if you switch to lazy builders. Now, this also works with pre-render callbacks. So currently we have two systems where you can go to the cache with a very small array that didn't do any heavy lifting, and then after the cache miss, we will actually start doing the heavy lifting. Pre-render callbacks are the same thing as lazy builders to that extent. There are differences. So you can only have one lazy builder instead of many pre-render callbacks. A lazy builder, if you specify that, you may not specify any element details. It's basically just a lazy builder. You can't even say, we need this theme hook, it's this type of element. There's nothing you can do. Pre-render callbacks are allowed to do this, and they add on to what's already there. So that's why you can have many pre-render callbacks. Lazy builders run before pre-render callbacks for that reason. And they're the only thing that supports placeholdering. Now, I'm not going to go too much into detail about placeholdering, but just a quick word about them anyways. Placeholdering is what makes the dynamic page cache entry less dynamic and therefore more reusable. To put that into layman words, if you imagine you have a header, and in that header you see your name, because there is this drop-down with your My Account information, right? That name is unique to you, so it varies by user. If we were to just keep that there, that would mean that the whole page, even though other people could see that exact same page, would be, well, it would be cached by you, but we don't cache pages per user. So that basically makes the whole page uncacheable. With placeholders, we remove that information for just a second, so that the whole page still exists without that thing that's specific to you, and now we can cache that page and perhaps serve it to anyone with the same level of permissions as you have. After we've gone to dynamic page cache, we put your username back in there. So that's how placeholders work. Using a lazy builder will automatically opt you into placeholdering, which is again one of the reasons why I recommend people use lazy builders far more often, because you don't need to worry about when you will or won't require a placeholder the renderer class will automatically placeholder things for you if they're highly dynamic. This is what you see in your services file under the renderer.auto placeholder conditions or something. So you can see that there's the user cache context in there, there's max age 0 in there, and you can add whatever you want in there. And then it will be automatically placeholdered. You can still choose to automatically placeholder something. There are some scenarios where you would want that, even though it's not highly variable. But all of this and more, I'm hoping to explain to you in Vienna. I've submitted a talk which goes in full detail about placeholders. I hope it gets accepted, and then I can spend a full hour explaining everything about placeholders, how they, what their life cycle is, etc. Moving on. I think I'm going really fast here, right? Oh no, it's fine, it's fine. Not optimizing your cache contexts. This is where it starts to get a bit more complicated. So too many variations will lose you the race. So there are 2 slides now coming from my talk. I forgot where, I think it was DrupalCamp Ghent, about variation cache. I'm not going to go into as much detail about variation cache here, but I'm going to quickly explain how it sort of works. So we have the concept of cache redirects. Before we go into this, imagine you have a drop-down on your user profile. And on your user profile, you can choose which type of dashboard theme, so to speak, you like. Whether you like an animal dashboard, so one that has like an elephant running across it, who knows, with cameras in the trees nowadays. Whether you have a plant dashboard, a dashboard with a lot of symbols, or one that shows you a sun or moon icon depending on the time of day and depending on the phase of the moon, right? The animal, plant, and symbols dashboards are nothing special. They don't vary. So at the very top, we specify a cache context, which is user.dashboard type. It's a custom one that we invented. And if it returns the word animal, then we show you the animal dashboard. If it returns the word plant, we show you the plant dashboard, etc. So the green ones are entries in the cache that we can directly find. There's nothing special. So we just follow that cache context, we find your entry, and hopefully we can find that same entry for everyone who also would like to see an animal dashboard. That's how you optimize things. Now, there is a cache redirect where we were expecting to find an icon for the moon or the sun. And a cache redirect is basically telling variation cache that, hold on, I cannot show you a green card here because I need more information. I don't know whether I need to show the moon or the sun. What is the time of day? Oh, it's daytime? Okay, now I can show you the sun, which is how we get to that green one. Or, it's nighttime. Okay, what is the phase of the moon? And once you answer that, I can show you whether it's new moon, first quarter, etc. That's how variation cache works in a nutshell. Now, all of these orange ones are expensive, because every time we look something up in the cache, and then we get this redirect in return. And that redirect tells us, you need to look further. So we need to go to the cache again. So every orange box is another cache get. Now, because we created a custom cache context to tell us that it's daytime or nighttime, and we're currently only using that to figure out which icon we need to show, we can optimize that. We can create a cache context which basically tells us whether it's daytime, new moon, first quarter, full moon, or last quarter. Let's say we don't need that cache context anywhere else, but just for this sake, then this is more optimal. Because now we have a cache redirect that can instantly get us to any of those 5 icons, and we've reduced our lookups by 1. So we're going 1 times fewer to the cache. So when writing custom cache contexts, and the emphasis is on custom, don't start messing about with the ones in core or contrib, but when you're writing custom cache contexts, then you should really contemplate how often you will use them. And if you only use them for one scenario, please try to optimize them. Okay? I have a full variation cache deep dive on YouTube. The link is there, but with all of my talks, I try to look up the recording afterwards, and I put them on my Drupal.org profile, so it's easy for you to find them. So instead of trying to figure out how to get that link onto your laptop or whatever, just go to Drupal.org, click on my profile, and you will find all the necessary links there. Then, and finally, so this is the fourth and final item, manually folding cache contexts. You really shouldn't do that, but I've seen it happen. This is also a little bit more advanced, but I'll try to do my best to explain it properly. What is cache context folding in a nutshell? So you might recognize this from the cache context manager, I believe, in core, and it explains how we fold cache contexts. So the important part is this. Let's say you have two cache contexts. One is A and one is A.B. So a more realistic example, one is user and the other is user.roles. What we do is we only check for user. Because if something varies by your user and you also have something that varies by your roles, well, we can just store that by your user because that is like less granular, the one thing. So that's what we do. Similarly, if you look more towards the bottom, you see x and x:foo is the same thing. If something varies by user.roles, and it also varies by user.roles:anonymous, well, we can fold that into user.roles, and that's what we'll use. Now, ironically, in the same screenshots, we have some very misleading texts. It says, for example, when caching per user, also caching per roles is meaningless because caching per roles is implied by per user. And this is correct. But it leads to incorrect code because people mistakenly think that whenever they have some code that should vary by user roles and somewhere below that they have code that varies by user, that they can simply just write user and all will be fine. Not necessarily true. So I should really open an issue where we change that wording a little bit. So what happens when we fold context? So what happens when, for instance, user and user roles get folded into user? Let's look at the user roles cache context. Each cache context has obviously the context value, but I've minimized that because we're not going to care about that. But at the bottom of each cache context, you will find get cacheable metadata. And there, in this scenario, you can see that we specify the cacheable metadata of the user. Why do we do that? Well, it's simple. Let's say I have a page that has a block on it that shows your user roles. That block varies by roles. And on the page, I have some more content that varies by user, like your username. Because we fold the contexts, the page will only vary by user. But that means that when you vary something by user, all we do is we check what is your user ID. Next time you get to that page, we check what is your user ID, and if we have a cache entry for that user ID, we show that entry. What happens if in the meantime your roles change? We would still be showing you that stale entry, because all we care about at this point, because we're varying by user, is your user ID, and that never changes. So when we fold the user roles cache context, we basically need to specify that whenever the user is saved, we need to invalidate whatever we just cached. Which is also why, for instance, in the user permissions cache context, you used to find the cacheable metadata of the user roles. That's no longer the case with the access policy API, but we used to find that. Because if we optimize that away, if one of your roles changed, that would affect your permissions. So we needed to invalidate whatever cache item we had that was tagged with an optimized user permissions cache context. So, yeah, I should have done that earlier. When to use only the user cache context then? So a good example is when you have one big soup, so to speak. Let's say you have a page where you want to show in the same item both your username and your user roles. Theoretically, it's fine to only use the user cache context there because when you show something of the user, you should always add the user as a cacheable dependency. If I have a page with my name on it, and I save my account to change my name, obviously we need to invalidate that page in the cache. So theoretically, it's safe if you have one big soup to just use the user cache context. However, I would still recommend that if you're showing roles, you do add the user roles cache context. It doesn't hurt because they're in the same big soup, and this goes deeper into variation cache territory, but because they're in the same big soup and they will always both be present, we will always optimize user roles away into user, which ends up with a cache entry with just user, and it will have the user as a cacheable dependency, something you did manually, so it's safe. Why do I say that you should still probably add the user roles cache context right where you are showing the user roles? Just in case that at some point, some junior comes along, takes that piece of code, cuts it out, puts it in a different place, and that's that. Because now they are showing something that should vary by roles, and it doesn't. So it's still safer to do that. We will optimize that away. It's like the tiniest of performance hit. It's like negligible, so it's fine. When you shouldn't only use the user cache context is a logical flow, and this is something we saw at the start of the talk when I was showing you those permission and access checks like in a chain. So there it's really dangerous to say, oh, hey, you know what, at the top I know I was varying by roles, but here at the bottom I'm varying by user, so in the end that's the same. Let's just vary by user. No, that's really dangerous. So I'm repeating myself here, but for instance, if you first check by permissions and you then check for owner, then you still need to return something that also varies by permissions. Otherwise, once we only vary by user, if your permissions change, you would still get access or an access denied. So again, that leads to security issues or frustrating issues where you should have access to something and you really, really don't. So ideally, you also, when you work with like user and user roles, you placeholder the user-specific bits, which is what I told you before. Use a lazy builder, and then you will be fine. And also, you will break variation cache. So if you play fast and loose with which cache context you assign at any given time, you will run into issues. So variation cache will not be able to properly build a redirect chain. And the funny thing is that variation cache is, how do I put it, healthy enough to not crash your website when that happens, but it's stupid enough to not notify you necessarily when that happens. And it will just have a bunch of cache misses. So you might put things into the cache and you will never really find them. Nowadays, we have a warning in variation cache, so we put some detection in there that will actually warn you when we think you are manually optimizing cache context. And it's rather cryptic, but for instance, we've seen it a lot with breadcrumbs, where a lot of breadcrumb builders were varying at least by route, but they weren't specifying that. And then in variation cache, we detected like, hey, sometimes, out of the blue, we get this route cache context here, but it's not consistent. So we threw a warning saying, what's going on here? And we actually figured out that something was wrong, and we fixed all of the breadcrumb builders in core and contrib. So the detection layer that we just added is actually quite useful. Also, if you break variation cache, I will be a really sad panda, because I've spent a lot of time working on it, and I would like everyone to use it properly. So those were the 4 items that I wanted to discuss today, and I still have so many more that I can discuss, but I think I nailed it because we have 7 minutes left for questions. So I think these 4 topics will have to make do for today. Any questions? Oh, and I need to turn on a microphone, or it's gone. Oh, there. You stole my microphone. Any questions? It can be like related to this, but if no one has questions related to this, then you can just ask me anything about caching, and I'll try to give you an answer.
And what scenario can you get that you said that the roles changed, but it was still cached by user, so you had access to something? How is that possible? Because if your roles change, the user will also be cleared everything from the cache.
Yes. So if you do it properly, if you specified both the user and the user roles cache contexts, then we will optimize away the user roles cache context, and by virtue of that, we will add the user as a cacheable dependency. So if the user changes, because perhaps the roles changed, then whatever was cached with that information will get flushed. with the scenario of user roles, you're usually actually quite safe because as soon as you display something of the user, people's habit is to add the user as a cacheable dependency themselves. But other cache contexts are not that lucky. So for instance, in the past, the user permissions cache context would not add the user as a cacheable dependency, just the roles, right? So there you could run into issues. Because if you forgot to add the user permissions cache context, then you would have a security issue on your hands. Someone's permissions might change, but the cache would not be aware of that. So it's really important that you always specify all of the cacheable metadata that is applicable, because worst case scenario, we will just optimize it away. But best case scenario, we will be dealing with variation cache and redirects, and then it's really important that it's all there. Okay. Anyone else? Yep, go ahead.
Hi, first of all, thank you for the talk. It's really informative. And I have a question regarding lazy builders and then pre-render callbacks.
Yes.
So if you go back, please, to this slide with the zoomed version.
Yes, let's zoom in on step 1, right?
Yes.
The fixed one, like this, or
no, next one, probably.
this one?
Or even more.
Wait. This is the one with the lazy builder, actually?
Yeah, when you explain later, then there is no hit, and then, yeah.
That one, yeah.
So, for example, on step 1, there will be this simple array with IDs, just example.
Yes, exactly.
Then we build like lazy builder and so on. And on the next one, this simple array will be already cached. And then lazy builder is running already after it. Yes?
It doesn't run anymore. So if we find it in the cache, it doesn't need to run. That's the whole benefit of it.
And what about the pre-renders? They also...
Same. So, good question. I love talking about the renderer. So very briefly, the renderer, it does a lot of things, but in that order, it checks the cache. If it doesn't find anything, it will do some sanity checks if there's a lazy builder to see whether the lazy builder was defined properly. Then it will call that lazy builder. And then, I'm not going to be talking about placeholders just yet. And then after that, it will call the pre-render hooks, pre-render callbacks, sorry. Then it considers the render array sort of complete, and it will start rendering them by going to the theming layer. When it returns, it will go to the cache and try to store whatever we have in the cache, and then it will just return that, and that will continue on to the rest of the response. With placeholdering, it's a bit more complicated because then we check whether the lazy builder specified that it always has to be placeholdered. If not, we check that cacheable metadata, and then we auto placeholder it. If we can't auto placeholder it yet, we first render it. And no, sorry, we first call the lazy builder, and then when we try to set it in the cache, we can still have late auto placeholdering where we find that after rendering, it's actually more dynamic than we thought, and then we still try to place it. So there it gets really complicated, which is why I want to have a full deep dive in Vienna. But essentially, lazy builders and pre-render callbacks, they only run when we couldn't find anything in the cache. And that's where the benefit comes from. Now,
one more question then. So if once I want to run lazy builder plus, I don't know, 1 pre-render callback, and next time I need 3 pre-render callbacks, will they be cached differently?
No, so if you have so in step 1, we're now going to the cache with a tiny render array, right? If that tiny render array changes, it means that you're doing something different now, right? So we need to either declare that to the cache with a cache context, for instance, or we need to flush the cache. So let's say you have version 1 of your page, and you're building it, and now you're like, oh shit, I need an extra pre-render callback, for instance. Yeah, you need to clear the cache, because the cache would still serve the old one, because all the cache looks at is the cache keys, yeah, and the cacheable metadata. So that's all they look at. So if you have, on the other hand, a scenario where you might have a set of pre-render callbacks depending on a given global value, let's say it's nighttime and now we need to do extra pre-rendering, then you need to have a cache context in there that specifies that, hey, it's nighttime.
And that it should be in this first array, yes?
That should be in the hashtag cache array.
Yeah,
so
in the first.
Yes, in the first array, yes. But again, that's still really cheap, because now you're just checking something really cheap and then you're doing that. But I would recommend that you do most of your checking afterwards. It's only when you realize beforehand that this tiny array still needs to have some notion of a bunch of variations, okay, specify it beforehand. But if you can, and it makes sense, so if there's no checking beforehand, then I would still recommend that you do most of the heavy lifting afterwards, because you can, because as I briefly mentioned, the cache will later on inspect if there was extra cacheable metadata coming from the lazy builder or the pre-render callbacks, and it will deal with that accordingly. But that really depends on the scenario. It's very abstract, and I would have to see that code to be able to guide you towards a decision. There's a case to be made for both, I would say.
Okay, thank you.
All right. Any other questions? No? Oh, yeah, let me go back to... There. So I was, thank you then, I would say. I am Kristiaanvandeneynde. Again, you can currently contact me on these addresses. So yeah, thank you.